The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Fort McDowell, casting long shadows across the dusty parade ground. In the stables behind the main barracks, Marcus Aurelius Santos worked in silence, his weathered hands methodically cleaning horse stalls that most soldiers wouldn't even glance at twice. At 52, Marcus had the look of a man carved by hardship and time. His graying hair stuck out from under a battered hat, and his simple brown work clothes were stained with mud and hay. The other soldiers saw only what they wanted to see: a dirty stable hand, beneath their notice, unworthy of their respect. "Look at him!" sneered Sergeant Diego Ferreira, his polished cavalry boots clicking against the wooden planks as he approached with two younger soldiers. "Old Marcus, king of the horse shit." His companions laughed, their brass buttons gleaming in the afternoon light. Marcus continued his work, not even looking up as he spread fresh straw in the stalls. The horses nickered softly at his approach. They, unlike the men, seemed to sense something different about him. "You deaf old man?" Diego kicked at the hay near Marcus's feet. "I'm talking to you." Finally, Marcus raised his head. His steel-gray eyes met Diego's for just a moment, long enough for the sergeant to catch something unsettling in that gaze, something that made him step back slightly. But the moment passed, and Marcus returned to his work. "Pathetic," Diego muttered, trying to regain his composure. "Come on, boys. Let's leave the stable rat to his work." Young Private Pablo Hernandez lingered for a moment, watching Marcus work with surprising gentleness as he tended to a lame horse's hoof. There was something in the way the older man moved, precise, careful, almost military in its efficiency. But Diego's voice calling from outside broke his thoughts, and he hurried after the others. The day wore on, and Marcus continued his routine. He knew every horse by name, every quirk and need. Thunder, the Colonel's stallion, always tried to bite newcomers, but stood perfectly still for Marcus. Bella, the mare with the white star, had been skittish since arriving from a harsh ranch, but she nuzzled Marcus's shoulder as he brushed her coat. As evening approached, Captain Elena Rodriguez made her rounds. Unlike most officers, she actually visited the stables, checking on the condition of the mounts. She'd noticed Marcus's work, how the horses were always healthy, the equipment always properly maintained, the stable cleaner than any she'd seen in her 15 years of service. "Evening, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the respect that most others withheld. "Evening, Captain," he replied quietly, his voice carrying a slight rasp that spoke of dust and hard living. "The horses look good. Thunder's limp seems better." Marcus nodded. "Cold compress twice daily, easy walking. He'll be fine in a few days." Elena noticed the way he spoke, not with the rough grammar of an uneducated ranch hand, but with the clear diction of someone who'd once held authority. She'd wondered about Marcus Santos since he'd arrived at the fort 6 months ago, but the man kept to himself, deflecting personal questions with the skill of someone accustomed to keeping secrets. That night, in the enlisted men's quarters, Diego held court as usual, regaling the younger soldiers with exaggerated tales of his cavalry charges and Indian battles. Most of his stories were borrowed from other men's experiences, embellished with each telling. "And then I rode straight into their camp, saber flashing in the moonlight," he boasted, gesturing wildly with his tin cup of coffee. 3 Apache warriors went down before they even knew what hit them. The young soldiers listened with wide eyes, desperate to believe that glory and heroism were so easily won. Pablo found himself thinking again of Marcus, remembering the brief moment when their eyes had met. There had been something there, not the empty gaze of a simple stable hand, but the look of someone who had seen real violence, real loss. "What about Marcus?" Pablo asked suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Where'd he come from before here?" The laughter died in the room. Diego's expression darkened. "What about him? He's nobody, a drifter who's good with horses. Why waste time thinking about stable trash?" But Pablo had planted a seed of curiosity. A few of the men exchanged glances. Now that they thought about it, there were strange things about the stable hand. His posture when he thought no one was looking, the way he could quiet even the most spirited horse with just a touch, the precise, economical way he moved, as if every action had been drilled into him through years of discipline. Outside, Marcus sat on a wooden crate behind the stables, looking up at the vast desert sky scattered with stars. In his weathered hands, he held something small and metallic, a medal tarnished with age and wear. The Congressional Medal of Honor, awarded for valor in action against Confederate forces at the Battle of Antietam, and again for his actions during the Indian Wars in the Dakota Territory. He'd earned it leading cavalry charges that made Diego's fictional exploits look like children's games. He'd saved lives, taken lives, carried wounded men to safety under enemy fire. But those days felt like another lifetime, another man's story. The medal caught the moonlight for a moment before Marcus tucked it back into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Tomorrow would bring more mockery, more disrespect, more invisibility. But he'd endured worse than wounded pride. Much worse. In the distance, a coyote howled, and Marcus closed his eyes, remembering other nights, other battles, other men who'd never made it home to see stars like these. 3 weeks later, Fort McDowell buzzed with unusual activity. Word had come that General William T. Sherman himself would be arriving for an inspection tour, a rare honor that had the entire garrison in a state of barely controlled panic. Colonel James Morrison paced his office like a caged wolf, barking orders at anyone within earshot. "I want every button polished, every horse groomed, every inch of this fort spotless. The general's reputation precedes him. He notices everything and he doesn't suffer fools." The stable became a particular focus of attention. Suddenly, officers who had never set foot near the horse pens were demanding improvements, modifications, perfect organization. Through it all, Marcus worked steadily, making the changes requested while privately noting that most of them were unnecessary. His stables were already in better condition than regulation required. Sergeant Diego seized the opportunity to assert his authority, strutting around the stable area like a peacock, criticizing Marcus's work and issuing contradictory orders. "This stall needs more straw," he declared, pointing at a perfectly adequate horse pen. "The regulation calls for—" Marcus began quietly. "I don't want to hear regulations from you, old man. I'm telling you what the general will want to see." Marcus bit back his response. He knew General Sherman personally, had served under him during the march through Georgia, had received his Medal of Honor from Sherman's own hands. But that knowledge was a burden he carried alone. As the day of the inspection approached, tensions grew thicker than the desert heat. Young Pablo found himself watching Marcus more closely, noticing things that troubled him. The way Marcus instinctively straightened when officers passed, not the servile posture of a servant, but the automatic response of a soldier. The way his eyes tracked movement around the fort with the awareness of someone trained in tactical observation. During a particularly harsh tongue-lashing from Diego about the arrangement of saddles, Pablo saw something that made his blood run cold. As Marcus bent to adjust a leather strap, his shirt shifted, revealing a portion of his back. Scars crisscrossed the weathered skin, not the random marks of accidents or hard work, but the systematic pattern of wounds from battle. Saber cuts, bullet grazes, the map of a warrior's life written in scar tissue. That evening, Pablo approached Captain Rodriguez, his conscience finally overcoming his fear of appearing foolish. "Captain, may I speak with you privately?" Elena studied the young soldier's troubled expression. "Of course, Private. What's on your mind?" "It's about Marcus, ma'am." "The stable hand." Pablo struggled to find the words. I think there's more to him than we know." "What makes you say that?" Pablo described what he'd observed, the military bearing, the scars, the way horses and even the fort's dogs seemed to recognize some innate authority in the humble stable hand. Elena listened without interruption. Her own observations had led her to similar conclusions, but hearing them confirmed by one of the enlisted men gave her pause. "Have you shared these thoughts with anyone else?" "No, ma'am, but I had to tell someone. It doesn't seem right the way he's treated, especially if he's what I think he might be." Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the parade ground. A dust cloud on the horizon announced the arrival of an advance party. General Sherman's inspection was beginning a day early. The fort exploded into activity. Men scrambled to final preparations, uniforms were hastily adjusted, and Diego screamed orders at everyone within range, including Marcus, who simply continued his work with the same steady patience he'd shown for months. "You better not embarrass this fort tomorrow, old man," Diego hissed, grabbing Marcus by the shirt. "If the general finds one thing wrong with these stables, I'll have you horsewhipped." For the first time since arriving at Fort McDowell, Marcus spoke directly to his tormentor. His voice was quiet, but it carried an edge that made Diego's grip loosen involuntarily. "The stables will pass inspection, Sergeant. They always do." There was something in those words, not a promise, but a statement of fact delivered with the confidence of a man who had faced much more intimidating figures than Diego Ferreira. As the sun set on what might be Marcus's last night of anonymity, he sat once again behind the stables, holding his medal in the dying light. Tomorrow, everything would change. He'd managed to hide for 6 months, to find the peace he'd sought after decades of violence and command. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. In the distance, the lights of the general's camp twinkled like fallen stars, and Marcus prepared himself for the reckoning that dawn would bring. General William Tecumseh Sherman arrived at Fort McDowell with the sunrise, his entourage kicking up clouds of red dust that painted the morning air. At 63, Sherman was still an imposing figure. Tall, lean, with piercing eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the fort's operation with a single glance. The inspection began with the usual military precision. Sherman reviewed the troops, examined the quarters, studied the supply logs. Colonel Morrison followed nervously at his side, pointing out improvements and explaining procedures with the desperate enthusiasm of a man whose career hung in the balance. Marcus continued his work in the stables, but he could feel the weight of approaching destiny. Through the wooden slats, he could see the inspection party making their rounds, and he recognized Sherman's distinctive silhouette. A little grayer than he remembered, but unmistakably the same man who had led them through hell and back during the war. Sergeant Diego was in his element, strutting beside the officers, ready to showcase what he considered his domain. The horses were perfectly groomed, the equipment gleaming, every detail exactly as regulation demanded. "And here, General, we have our stable facilities," Colonel Morrison announced as the group approached. "Sergeant Ferreira has done an excellent job maintaining our cavalry mounts." Sherman nodded, but his experienced eye was already noting details that impressed him. The horses were in exceptional condition, better than he'd seen at far better funded installations. The leather was properly oiled, the stalls were spotless, and there was an overall sense of professionalism that spoke of genuine expertise. "These horses are in remarkable condition," Sherman observed. "Who's responsible for their day-to-day care?" Diego stepped forward eagerly. "I supervise all stable operations, sir, though we do have a civilian worker who handles the manual labor. I'd like to meet this worker." The colonel and Diego exchanged glances. They hadn't expected the general to show interest in a mere stable hand. He's just a local man, General. Nothing special about him." But Sherman was already walking toward the back of the stables, where Marcus was quietly brushing down Thunder, the colonel's stallion. The horse, known for his aggressive temperament with strangers, stood perfectly calm under Marcus's gentle touch. Marcus heard the approaching footsteps and felt his heart begin to race. 20 years of military discipline warred with 6 months of carefully constructed anonymity. He kept working, hoping against hope that he could remain invisible just a little longer. "Impressive work," Sherman's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "This stallion has quite a reputation for being difficult." Marcus didn't look up, but his hands stilled on the horse's flank. "He just needs understanding, sir. Patience." Sherman stopped dead in his tracks. That voice, he knew that voice. Slowly, Marcus raised his head, and their eyes met across 20 years of separation and silence. The recognition was instantaneous and mutual. Sherman's weathered face broke into an expression of amazement and something approaching joy. "Marcus Aurelius Santos," he said quietly, and the name fell into the sudden silence like a stone into still water. What happened next would be talked about in the fort for years to come. General William T. Sherman, commander of the military division of the Missouri, hero of the Civil War, snapped to attention and rendered a perfect military salute to the humble stable hand. "Colonel Marcus Santos," Sherman said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned gathering, "it is my honor to see you again." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sergeant Diego's mouth fell open. Colonel Morrison looked as though he'd been struck by lightning. Young Pablo felt his knees go weak as the pieces of the puzzle suddenly snapped into place. Marcus slowly straightened, and for the first time in 6 months, he didn't hide who he was. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted, and everyone present could suddenly see what had been there all along, the bearing of a born commander, the quiet dignity of a true warrior. "General Sherman," Marcus replied, returning the salute with military precision. "Sir." "Gentlemen," Sherman announced, turning to address the stunned officers, "allow me to introduce Colonel Marcus Aurelius Santos, recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor, hero of Antietam and the Dakota campaigns, and one of the finest cavalry officers I've ever had the privilege to serve alongside." The silence that followed was deafening. Diego looked as though he might faint. The younger soldiers stared in wonder at the man they dismissed as worthless stable trash. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, her face flushed with a mixture of vindication and embarrassment. "Sir," she addressed Sherman directly, "if I may ask, why is Colonel Santos working in our stables?" Sherman's expression grew gentle as he looked at Marcus. "That's his story to tell, Captain. But I suspect it has something to do with finding peace after seeing too much war." Marcus nodded slowly. "After Dakota Territory, I needed to step away, to find quiet. The horses don't judge, don't ask for stories of glory. They just need care and kindness." "And you found that here," Sherman said, understanding in his voice. "I did, sir, until today." Diego finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "Colonel, Sir, I didn't know." Marcus turned to look at his former tormentor, and Diego saw not anger in those steel-grey eyes, but something far worse. Disappointment. "No, Sergeant, you didn't know. But perhaps that should have made you wonder rather than assume." The words were quietly spoken, but they hit Diego like physical blows. Around him, the other soldiers who had participated in the mockery looked sick with shame. Young Pablo stepped forward, his voice shaking with emotion. "Sir, I'm sorry, Colonel. We should have known." Marcus's expression softened as he looked at the young private. "You did see, son. You questioned what others accepted. That takes courage." General Sherman surveyed the group, his experienced eyes taking in the lesson being learned in real time. "Gentlemen, what you've witnessed today is a reminder that greatness often wears humble clothes. The man you dismissed as worthless has charged into enemy fire to save his comrades, has led cavalry against impossible odds, has earned honors that most soldiers only dream of achieving." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. But more importantly, he chose humility over pride, service over recognition. That, perhaps, is the greatest lesson of all. Colonel Morrison, his face red with embarrassment, stepped forward. "Colonel Santos, sir, This is inexcusable. The way you've been treated at my post is in the past," Marcus replied firmly. "No harm was done that cannot be healed." But even as he spoke with forgiveness, everyone present knew that everything had changed. The Invisible Man was invisible no longer, and with his revelation came a reckoning that would echo through Fort McDowell for years to come. As the inspection continued, Marcus found himself walking beside Sherman, two old soldiers sharing memories and catching up on the years that had passed. The other men watched with newfound respect and no small amount of wonder. That evening, as the sun painted the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus sat once again behind the stables. But now he was not alone. Young Pablo approached hesitantly, his hat in his hands. "Colonel Santos, sir? May I ask you something?" Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile anyone at the fort had seen from him. "Of course, son. Will you stay, now that everyone knows who you are?" Marcus looked out at the vast desert landscape, then back at the young soldier's earnest face. "I think my hiding days are over, Pablo. But that doesn't mean my service has to end. There are different ways to serve, different battles to fight. Like teaching." "Like teaching," Marcus agreed. "Like showing young soldiers that true strength comes not from what others think of you, but from what you choose to do when no one is watching." Pablo nodded solemnly, understanding that he was receiving a lesson that would shape the rest of his military career. As night fell over Fort McDowell, the transformation was complete. The Invisible Man had become visible again, not through his own choice, but through the recognition of someone who understood the true measure of a soldier's worth. And in that recognition, both he and those around him had discovered something profound about honor, humility, and the unexpected places where greatness can be found. The horses in their stalls nickered softly in the darkness, and Marcus smiled. Some things, at least, would never change. 6 months had passed since General Sherman's visit to Fort McDowell, and the desert fort had become a different place entirely. The transformation wasn't just in how the men treated Marcus. It was in how they carried themselves, how they understood what it truly meant to serve with honor. Marcus had accepted Colonel Morrison's offer to become the fort's official training instructor, though he'd kept his quarters near the stables. "Old habits," he told Captain Rodriguez with a slight smile. The horses still brought him peace, and he wasn't ready to abandon that completely. On this particular morning, Marcus stood before a group of new recruits who had arrived from back east, their uniforms still crisp, their faces still soft with the innocence of youth. Among them was a young man who reminded Marcus painfully of himself at that age, eager, proud, and convinced that glory was something to be seized rather than earned. "My name is Colonel Marcus Santos," he began, his voice carrying easily across the parade ground. "Some of you may have heard stories about me. Forget them. What matters is not what I've done, but what you choose to do." In the back of the group, Pablo, now promoted to corporal, watched with pride. He'd requested to stay at Fort McDowell specifically to learn from Marcus, turning down a transfer to a more prestigious posting back east. "The first lesson," Marcus continued, "is that a soldier's worth isn't measured by the shine on his buttons or the volume of his voice. It's measured by his character when no one is watching." One of the new recruits, a cocky young man named Thompson from Philadelphia, raised his hand with obvious skepticism. "Begging your pardon, Colonel, but don't we need to show strength, command respect?" Marcus studied the young man for a moment, seeing echoes of Sergeant Diego in his attitude. Diego himself had requested a transfer shortly after Sherman's visit, unable to face the daily reminder of his own failures in judgment. "Tell me, Private Thompson, what do you think commands more respect? A man who demands it, or a man who earns it?" "Demands it, sir. You have to show people you're not to be trifled with." Several of the other recruits nodded in agreement. Marcus felt a familiar sadness, These young men had so much to learn, and some of those lessons would be harder than others. "Corporal Hernandez," Marcus called out, "would you share with these men how you first met me?" Pablo stepped forward, his face flushing slightly. "Sir, when I first arrived at this fort, I participated in mocking a man I thought was just a stable hand. I judged him by his dirty clothes and humble work, never bothering to look deeper." He paused, his voice growing stronger. "That man was Colonel Santos. While I was laughing at him, he was quietly doing his duty, caring for the animals that could mean the difference between life and death on patrol. He never demanded my respect. But when I finally understood who he was, I realized he'd earned it 1,000 times over." Thompson's cocky expression began to waver. "But, sir, surely there are times when you have to assert authority." Marcus nodded. "There are. But let me tell you about real authority, son. Real authority comes from your men's trust that you'll never ask them to do something you wouldn't do yourself. It comes from them knowing that you value their lives more than your own reputation." He began walking among the recruits, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "I once served under an officer who shouted orders from the rear while sending men to die for his own glory. And I served under another who led every charge himself, who knew every soldier's name, who shared their hardships without complaint. Guess which one his men would have followed into hell itself?" The morning training continued with practical exercises, horsemanship, weapon maintenance, formation drills. But Marcus wove lessons of character throughout each activity. When Thompson's horse shied away from him, Marcus demonstrated the patient, gentle approach that had served him so well in the stables. "The horse doesn't care about your rank, Private. It only cares whether you treat it with respect and understanding. Leadership works much the same way." As the weeks passed, Marcus noticed the subtle changes in his students. Thompson began helping younger recruits with their equipment instead of mocking their mistakes. The group started working together instead of competing for individual recognition. But the real test came when a band of Apache raiders began hitting settlements near the fort. Colonel Morrison called his officers together to plan a response, and for the first time since returning to active duty, Marcus found himself preparing for actual combat. "We'll take 2 companies, Morrison announced, studying the map spread across his desk. "Hit them fast and hard before they can retreat to the mountains." Captain Rodriguez looked troubled. "Sir, the terrain they're operating in is perfect for ambushes. We could be walking into a trap." Marcus studied the map silently, his experienced eye noting the tactical challenges. The younger officers waited for his input. His reputation had preceded him, and they knew his counsel was worth hearing. "The captain's right," he said finally, "but there's another consideration. These aren't random raids. They're testing our response time and strength. If we don't respond decisively, they'll grow bolder." "What do you recommend, Colonel?" Morrison asked. "A smaller force, moving fast and quiet. 20 men, hand-picked for their tracking skills and marksmanship. We find their camp, study their patterns, then strike when they're divided." Thompson, who had been assigned to the mission despite his inexperience, spoke up nervously. "Sir, wouldn't more men be safer?" Marcus looked at the young private with understanding. "Sometimes, son, the safest course is the one that looks most dangerous. More men mean more noise, more chances to be spotted, more logistics to manage. In country like this, stealth serves better than strength." The mission was approved, and Marcus found himself leading men into combat for the first time in years. But this time was different. He wasn't the young, glory-hungry officer he'd once been. He was a seasoned leader who understood that every man under his command had a family waiting for him to come home. The patrol moved through the desert like ghosts, following Apache sign that would have been invisible to untrained eyes. Marcus had chosen his men well. Pablo was there, along with several other soldiers whose character he'd come to trust during training. On the second day, they found the raiders' camp in a box canyon, hidden among red rocks and twisted juniper trees. Marcus studied it through his field glasses, counting men and noting their weapons and horses. 12 warriors, he whispered to Pablo. Well armed, but they're not expecting trouble. See how their horses are unsaddled? They feel safe here. Do we attack now, sir? Marcus shook his head. Patience. We watch. We learn their routines. Then we plan. It was a lesson in leadership that no classroom could have taught. Marcus didn't rush into battle to prove his courage. He took the time to ensure his men's best chance of survival while still accomplishing the mission. When they finally struck, it was at dawn, swift and precise. The Apache warriors fought fiercely, but were caught completely off guard. The battle was over in minutes, with no casualties among Marcus's men, and the raiders either dead or scattered to the winds. But it was what happened next that truly defined Marcus's leadership. As the men searched the captured camp, they found evidence that the raiders had been holding 2 settler children captive, a boy and girl who had been taken from a burned homestead weeks earlier. The children were terrified, speaking no English and having been traumatized by their captivity. While his men secured the camp, Marcus knelt beside them, speaking gently in the Apache language he'd learned during his earlier campaigns. Thompson watched in amazement as the feared colonel transformed into something approaching a grandfather, coaxing smiles from the frightened children with patience and kindness. "Sir," Thompson asked quietly, "how do you know their language?" Marcus looked up from bandaging a cut on the little girl's arm. "Because I took the time to learn it, son. You can't truly defeat an enemy you don't understand, and you can't help people you can't communicate with." The ride back to Fort McDowell was triumphant, but Marcus remained focused on the children's welfare rather than celebrating the mission's success. He shared his own rations with them, told them stories during the long desert evenings, and gradually coaxed them out of their shell of fear. When they finally reached the fort, word of the successful mission had already spread. The children were reunited with relatives from a nearby settlement, and Marcus stood quietly in the background as others received the praise and congratulations. Colonel Morrison approached him after the formal debriefing. "Outstanding work, Marcus. The territorial governor wants to recommend you for promotion." Marcus shook his head with a slight smile. "I appreciate the thought, Colonel, but I'm exactly where I need to be." That evening, as was now his custom, Marcus sat behind the stables watching the sunset. But he wasn't alone. Several of his students had taken to joining him, not for formal instruction, but for the quiet wisdom that came from simply being in the presence of a man who had found peace with himself. Thompson was among them, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine respect and a desire to learn. "Colonel," he asked hesitantly, "back there with those children? That wasn't military training, was it?" Marcus considered the question. "Everything is military training, son, if you look at it right. A soldier's job isn't just to fight, it's to protect what's worth protecting. Sometimes that means charging into battle, and sometimes it means knowing how to comfort a frightened child." Pablo nodded thoughtfully. "Like cleaning stables. You taught us that no task is beneath a true soldier if it serves the greater good." "Exactly." Marcus pulled out his old medal, the one he'd hidden for so long, and held it up to catch the last rays of sunlight. "This piece of metal doesn't make me a hero. What makes a hero is the choice to do what's right, even when no one is watching, even when you won't be thanked for it." He tucked the medal away again, but this time he left his shirt pocket unbuttoned, no longer hiding who he was, but not flaunting it either. "The real question," he continued, "is what kind of man you choose to be when the uniform comes off, when the war is over, when there's no one left to impress but yourself." As the stars began to appear in the vast desert sky, Marcus looked around at the young faces surrounding him and felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope for the future. These men would carry forward the lessons they'd learned, would lead with honor instead of ego, would understand that true strength came from service rather than dominance. The stable hand had become a teacher, the hidden hero had found his true calling, and in doing so, he had discovered that his greatest victory wasn't any battle he'd won, but the character he'd helped shape in the next generation of soldiers. Fort McDowell had become more than just a military outpost. It had become a place where young men learned not just how to fight, but how to live with honor. And at its heart was a man who had learned that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in seeking glory, but in choosing humility, not in demanding respect, but in earning it through quiet service to others.